Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I'm Javjit Chadha, the director of the National Institute. This is a seminar we've organised in the last couple of days. You'd be aware of what can only be described as political and economic volatility that has left the country in somewhat of a spin in the last couple of days. And in the middle of all of that, in the emphasis in Westminster, we've been thinking very hard about the correct path of monetary and fiscal policy at these very difficult times. It's a truism to say that the British economy is a very open one, so what we see happening in the rest of the world, and there's clearly turmoil there as well, is often reflected in the UK. Unfortunately, to some extent, in the last few weeks, we reflected some of that back to the rest of the world with some of the policy decisions that have been made. We'd be very aware of our views on the mini-budget and the way that was handled and the extent to which experts' advice was once again undermined. It seems to be a leitmotif of the last 6.5 years, where expert advice seems to be, in some cases, disregarded, or in some cases even undermined. And if one positive thing can come out of the last few weeks is that sense in which we do need robust analysis, diagnosis, and discussion of really critical issues that matter to people of this country and in other parts of the world, because Britain is still a place that other parts of the world look at as an example, as an exemplar. Our very own official budget responsibility, the independence of the Bank of England, and the rigour with which the Treasury attaches to much of its analysis, but return was something that other countries look to as an example of how to do things. And within that, in the context, I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome you to discuss the energy price guarantee and think about what might come next. The Institute has been the vanguard of questioning the sense of that energy price guarantee, but it's not only the Institute. I'm delighted this afternoon to introduce Timo Fetzer, Professor of Economics at the University of Warwick, as well as Ben Moll, who's also is Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, I should say. Both of them have been very closely thinking about how appropriately to design any form of support for energy prices in the UK from Timo, but elsewhere in Europe, particularly in Germany from Ben. And as well, after the two presentations, first from Timo and Ben, I'm delighted that Adrian Pabst, our Deputy Director for Social Policy, will be able to talk about some of the work we've been doing and thinking about the impact of these large energy price shocks and the household distribution in the UK. I'm incredibly hopeful that we will be able to progress the policy in the direction we would want it to be progressed and not have an unconditional guarantee, which is incredibly costly. One of the things that we've been talking about for the last few weeks is this so-called fiscal black hole, driven by unfunded tax cuts, but a lot of that is dwarfed by the initial size of the energy price guarantee. And if we can get that right, in some worlds that could even be fiscally neutral, which would leave a lot of space for the public investment that we think as an institute. And I don't want to necessarily include Timo, Ben and Adrian in that view, but we can have that discussion, which many of us think is appropriate for the UK at this moment. So let me use that as an opening shot and see if the slides will move on. I'm not sure they will. So I'm going to wait for my wonderful colleague Neil to teach me how to move a slide home, because everyone who knows me knows I'm also generally useless. So while economists interested in energy price shock, the point to get across, and we've done this with many people to explain that, what we had as a result of the increase in energy and fuel prices is what economists call a negative supply shock. That means the supply of the economy, which is this vertical line here, has moved to the left. And that means that we're unable to produce the same quantity of goods and services given prevailing energy price costs that we could a year or so ago. So we are poorer as an economy. Kind of economics 101. But it's the point that we need to understand in the first instance. As not an energy producer, as a consumer now, the costs of the things that we're producing have gone up. Therefore, we are ultimately in a lower income situation. And that is simply the shift of this curve to the left that we've seen. And there's nothing we can do about that. We have to accept that world prices have moved against us in terms of things that we're importing and using for our own domestic production. To be clear, energy doesn't only go into heating your house, it goes into the production of anything that we do in the economy. It's the kind of process that we have of changing energy inputs into outputs in our economy. So the question then is, if that's the case, why are we buried in terms of macroeconomic fiscal policy to deal with that now? So the Institute earlier this year in the spring said, look, let's take this earning income, which I should ask you to look at that sets of dotted lines and triangles, and imagine there's a central line which is around 3 to 4%. So that shift to the supply curve is an aggregate earning income of around 3 to 4%, which in the long run is something we have to accept. But what we can also see, given the nature of the income distribution in the UK, that it is one that has an immensely heterogeneous effect across the household distribution. It has a much larger negative shock for people at the bottom of the income distribution than it has for people right at the top. And before we even go into the examination of this distribution, we also need to remember that these very same households, at the top or the bottom, were entering this shock with a very different financial position. By and large, the increase in savings that we saw in the economy at the household level in the 2 years of COVID, 20 and 21, an increase in savings we estimate of something like 185 to 200 billion pounds, was very much concentrated with people at the top end of the distribution. People at the bottom end of the distribution had more precarious jobs. They're the people that went on furlough. They're the people that also, in some cases, lost their jobs. So what you have is a double form of shock. Their savings have been exhausted, their incomes have been more precarious, and because of the nature of their expenditure patterns, they're suffering a much larger personal shock than the aggregate shock we're seeing in the economy. It's therefore critical that policymakers think about whether that size of shock is appropriate or equitable for people who've also gone through a very difficult 2-year period. And I think this is the essential motivation for thinking about how we smooth the adjustment to a higher, potentially permanent price level for energy. How can we smooth the responses for those at the bottom who are unable to draw upon savings that they have, or indeed may have precarious jobs, which means that they are not in a position to deal with the shocks in the way that those of us fortunate enough to have more permanent jobs can deal with? There are a number of really critical issues there for government to address. And as an institute, along with many other independent economists, we've been pointing out the government has had to do more as targeted support for these sets of people. And there are two transitions that we're talking about here. The first transition is to the lower level of aggregate income that I've already talked about. Remember, we're not a producer of oil, we're a consumer. So if the relative price of energy has gone up and we're a consumer, there's an income effect, which means that we're poorer permanently than we'd be otherwise. And as well as an economy and as a world, we also want to transition to a greener future. There's a world in which we definitely, well, the only world we've got, we have to ensure that the quantum of carbon emission in the end is not large enough to threaten life on this planet. So there's two issues that are here, but actually they complement each other. And before going into that, I want to say at the same time, those very same households, not necessarily at the bottom of the distribution, but more in the middle of the distribution, also dealing with the fact that because of the temporary inflation, interest rates, mortgages and credit rates are also being ratcheted up. There are good reasons for that, following the temporary inflation shock, but that is also a cost that households are currently having there. So what is the role of fiscal policy? I know Tina, Glenn and Adrian will come to this very shortly. I think there are 3 or 4 points that I know we'll start to move towards an answer. First of all, how much aggregate support is required? But how much are we going to want to offset the fall in aggregate demand from the decrease in income? Now, if we try to do too much, which is what happened with the set of unfunded tax cuts that we saw last month, that only means that interest rates set by the Bank of England will have to rise even more. And that was the ultimate cause for the sharp fall in gilt prices. Interest rate expectations were cranked up very quickly from 3 to 4% to as high as 6%. But maybe we want to do a little bit, particularly if it helps the poorer household. And against that need to support aggregate demand for the poorest households, we have to ask ourselves, what level of fiscal space do we have? Do we want to completely exhaust it by offering unconditional support even for the richest households, or should we be targeting? I think you've got an idea of what my answer is, but let me pose the question that way. Secondly, we're essentially providing a hedge to households against very volatile energy prices. Nobody can predict where energy prices are going to be in any world. So there's a question of what horizon we provide that support. The longer we provide the support, the more costly that option is typically going to be. But if we don't provide support over a longer horizon, then the poorest households will continue to face uncertainty as to whether they can pay their bills. There needs to be a discussion as to how long this is in place for, but has been, at least until recently, absent from the debate. Can we do something to encourage a green transition? Should we be asking people who use energy more intensively to pay more for it than the margin? It's interesting that a very good instrument for income in this country at the household level is actually energy usage. So if you wanted to design a progressive tax, you'd want to probably link it to energy usage. Now, that doesn't follow monotonically, because there are poorer households who are living in less good housing, potentially with larger families, and also pay higher energy bills, but that could be dealt with some form of transfer. So I think these are the questions we want to raise. How do we target the poorest? How do we target the most vulnerable? And how do we get the money out to them quickly, given that they're cash constrained? This can't wait a year or two. If you can't pay the bills, you can't pay the bills right now, and you need not be living up arrears. I've tried to summarize some of the issues that I know everyone else will go into in more detail. Thank you very much, everyone. Let me introduce Timo Fetzer, who I also want to congratulate, if I may, for having just won the Philip Human Prize for Economics in 2022. Wonderful news, Timo.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being with us online. Ultimately, before I start getting into the sort of technical work and the technical detail, I want to sort of remind us all why we are facing this crisis. Ultimately, we're facing this crisis, and Timo Frey from the Kiev School of Economics, the head of the Kiev School of Economics, was also meant to be here, but I'm not sure. He might be in a shelter now, so who knows? We're facing this crisis because there is a brutal war that is happening in there. And as part of this war, energy is being weaponized to actually fight a hybrid war, which means, the objective here is quite obvious: to sow instability in the West, to actually sort of bring out a lot of the fissures and frictions that have been building up over decades in most Western societies, to create this instability, to undermine the resolve and the support that much of the West has actually given to the Ukrainian people in their self-defense. So I think it's really important to always remind ourselves this crisis doesn't come from nowhere. It comes because of essentially an attempt to break down the sort of global peace order that was established after the Second World War. So, but in this crisis, there's also huge opportunity because it creates a unique alignment actually of multiple incentives. We have the incentive that we actually need to protect and preserve the planet, which means saving energy, saving carbon emissions. And that actually is now aligned with saving money, because actually it is a lot cheaper to consume energy if we consume less energy. We can actually cut back and do that, save resources. And ultimately, it's also aligned with the incentive of maintaining our ability to support to blunt Putin's energy weapon that is being used. So ultimately, we have a beautiful alignment of actually money, societal objectives, serving the environment, serving money, and actually kind of freeing ourselves from that that threat and this leverage that is being used against us. And ultimately, politics should be doing its level best to make sure that we realize this. And ultimately, this is the unique opportunity that affords itself here. So we need to understand and study economic policy making from that perspective. And as I said, this is ultimately also the moral imperative here, that we actually can do a lot at home to make sure that this crisis does not divide us, and it actually enables us to keep on supporting while also protecting the planet to make sure that it remains habitable. So this is part of a broad research agenda that we started working on, big team, lots and lots of things, and what I'm presenting today is only a small piece of this. But ultimately, we've been building sort of an environment, sort of a toolbox that will allow us to essentially, down to the individual property level, measure the impact and simulate various policies covering about 50% of the UK residential housing stock. So it's a huge data effort where we use public data, the energy performance certificate as one data source, anonymized individual level meter reading data by about 4 million households and many, many other sources, which will allow us to simulate the effects that various energy price scenarios will have, policy choices have, ultimately down to the individual household level. It will help us to quantify also the hidden energy savings potential that's locked up, that's right here to be sort of open up to actually help us bring down our energy consumption. It helps us to evaluate and design policy proposals ex ante, but also actually evaluate what is happening in a real-time basis, just in time, because we can set up econometric evaluation frameworks in a forward-looking way to actually evaluate what is going on. As I said, this is part of a broader research agenda. I will now talk about the energy price guarantee, why is it bad, and how we can actually possibly tweak it or change it, and why this is actually necessary to do, because it sets not just wrong incentives, but really very wrong incentives in many, many ways. So I'll just walk down through a few facts, because some of these are actually not really rare to everybody. So the energy price guarantee disproportionately benefits well-off households, and it is doing so through two margins. The first one is through the standing charge. The standing charge is paid by all households irrespective of the level of consumption. And that standing charge was in fact increased in line with the off-gens price cap, which means everybody now pays a higher standing charge irrespective of how much they consume, where the unit rate was lowered relative to what the off-gen predictions or sort of suggestions cap would have been, which would have been a binding cap at any level, which highlights we actually have this policy is regressive in two ways, through the standing charge as well as through the unit rate. So we can look at what this does actually to an average household and to the distribution of energy consumption. And as I said, the average household in the UK consumes about 17,000 kilowatt hours of energy, but energy consumption is a strong proxy of income, which is what is plotted here. You see that actually the households with an annual income of about 150K and over, and their energy consumption is at least, on average, twice as high as the average household, which obviously means they stand to benefit most from the energy price guarantee through this mechanism. Now, it's very good and very interesting because we can actually, unlike income taxation, these things are not very salient. We don't actually know what is behind a certain level of energy consumption. But here, it's actually very easy and very visible. The left picture here is a property that's a typically, English house and terrace, is typically inhabited by two family with two children. And the right picture, is a mansion. That mansion is estimated to consume about 60,000 to 70,000 kilowatt hours, which is about 4 to 5 times as much as the net property consumes. So people can actually relate to what this actually means in real life in a way that's very different than, let's say, just general tax cuts, which, some people might benefit, some people might benefit more or less. Here it becomes very salient. And I think that's why this particular topic should motivate and inspire a lot of people to actually think and question how does actually politics produce policy outcomes like this. Because obviously, it seemed to have been, for some people thought that this was a good idea. Now, importantly, even within the highest earning income bracket, energy consumption is highly variable. Just as we have for the very low income bracket, also for the high income bracket, it's very, very, very variable. And we can quantify the implicit subsidy that the energy price guarantee implies, which is essentially the wedge between the market price and the price that is sort of regulated, capped through the energy price guarantee. And so we can work out how much this actually boils down to in terms of pounds per household. And the red line here, the solid red line, is the average across the UK. And you see, not surprisingly, the subsidy is increasing in energy consumption. Along the horizontal axis, we have the percentiles. So the 95th percentile consumes, the households in the 95th percentile consume more than 95% of all other households. So you see the subsidy is increasing because it's increasing consumption. But actually, even among the highest earners, which is those on an income of 150K and over, we see that 50% of the households with an income of 150K and over actually benefit only half as much as the top 5% in this 150K and plus bracket. So there's a lot of people that we would typically considered to be financially very well off, who actually don't benefit from this energy price guarantee as much as some of the other higher earning peers do. So it highlights it's extremely uneven, even among high earners. And this is why so many people find this policy extremely alienating, because the conventional supporters of this type of, let's say, regressive policy making, who stand to benefit from tax cuts and whatnot, actually don't realize, well, this is actually not for me, because I'm actually not living in a house like here on the right. So the UK, and this is the third fact that comes out of this research, and again, all of this is public data. This is there for everybody to taking. It's there, it's visible, so we can study it, we can look at it, we can question it. This is there, it's in the public domain, so it's there in plain sight. This is happening. The UK has a huge untapped energy savings potential that's basically embedded in its inefficient building stock, and that's extremely energy inefficient. You will see this as this letter grading for properties, whereby this particular example can go from D to C. We estimate that using the FGEM 22 October price cap that was not implemented, that was replaced by the energy price guarantee, we can estimate that the financial savings that households could make if they were to upgrade their properties to the highest energy efficiency standard, especially through insulation measures, they could save at that price about £10 billion per year. And if that scales to the full population of properties, we only, as I said, have microdata for about half of them, it's closer to 20 billion. There's good reasons to believe that the properties for which we don't have EPCs actually have even more savings potential. There's empirical data that supports this. And these are savings that actually are an awesome tax cut, right? Because it actually reduces it increases household disposable income, and it does so in a way that actually reduces carbon emission, and actually, as I said, contributes to its own financing, and because it basically savings that pays for itself. So we can quantify this in terms of the energy, the cost, and the CO2 dimension. As I said, it's about household energy consumption could go down by about 30% if if the property stock was just upgraded to the highest energy efficiency standard. That would amount to between 10 to 20 billion in savings at current prices, or at October 22 off-gem market prices, and up to 30 to 40% reduction in CO2 emissions, which we have to bear in mind also comes with a monetary value, because there is carbon emissions trading, and we're expected to see higher cost of carbon in the future, which ultimately at some point will be borne by households. So how does the EPG mess around with these incentives? Because obviously by lowering the price that consumers have to pay for energy, it ultimately will mean that the energy savings are also worth less. And so it changes fundamentally the economics of energy efficiency upgradings. What is also very salient in this picture here on the very left, we have how much would these 30% energy savings translate into pounds at the pre-war prices. And that was about 3 billion. And so much, much lower than what we predicted to be under the off-gem October 22 prices, where we said it's around 10 billion. And as I said, and again, once we scale this to the full building stock, it'll be roughly twice that number. And the subsidy that the EPG applies obviously devalues that savings, the monetary value of these savings, because it subsidizes consumption, and without actually, it's just burning money for people to keep on living the way that they live, when we know that because of the climate transition, we will need to adapt and change. And this is what market economies are actually good at, being adaptive, being able to change. And now, the fifth fact is that actually the energy savings potential, just like energy consumption, is highly unevenly distributed across households. And it turns out that actually, if we look at the energy consumption distribution, and that actually goes around the 90th percentile of energy consumption. That means 90% of UK households consume less energy than they do, and the energy savings potential is 6 times as high than the energy savings potential that the households in the 10th percentile. And that's actually twice as high as the energy consumption multiple, right? The ratio of the 90% of the 10th percentile, which just highlights that the energy savings potential is even more unevenly distributed than the actual energy consumption by itself. And it turns out that most of this, we know that high energy consumption is associated with high incomes. It turns out that the highest energy savings potential is actually locked up in the real estate that is typically lived in by people who are quite well off, who basically to date simply didn't care. Let's look at this picture, and this is something just to give you a sense of the granularity of what we can do with this data. We can essentially model household energy consumption. We can aggregate the data up in any different way and thereby look at what are some statistical patterns that arise. On the vertical axis, we have the energy savings potential in pounds for the average household. And on the horizontal axis, we have the average annual household income in a spatial unit. So in a district or MSOA, we can do this in various levels. Now, what you see here as a bottom line, the black line is essentially the value of the energy savings potential in pounds at pre-war prices. And what you will see is that whether you were living in a rich part of the UK or a poor part of the UK, it didn't really make a big difference. And the energy savings in terms of money value was very, very similar for the average household. Now with the price shock, with the war starting and prices shooting up, you see that the energy savings potential, the value of it triples, because the energy prices have broadly tripled, at least as per this price measurement. But not only does it triple, also the gradient, the relationship between essentially income in areas wealth and the amount of energy savings in terms of pound has become more steep, which highlights, a simple fact that a lot of the people who keep on, typically talk about energy savings, or it's very important to do the net zero transition. A lot of the talking heads that we listen to very frequently, who live typically very privileged lives, actually don't put deeds to where the words are. And so we actually need, there's a lot of things that we can do right in our vicinities, right in our neighborhood, right around the corner to actually make sure that, deeds follow words. And in particular, it would make a lot more sense. The public money would be much better spent to actually create additional incentives to make sure that high income households realize these energy savings potentials that are locked up in their real estate, and possibly through investment tax credits, or in particular for lower income segments, to provide grants to those households who simply don't have the cash ones to do. And actually, there is a U-shape in all of this. There is a set of vulnerable people, vulnerable households in specific areas who simply are cash constrained. They are really facing abject deprivation, and because they can't actually lower their energy consumption beyond, they're just tied by their poor building stock. And this is why it's very important to think in a very targeted way to use fiscal resources in a much more sustainable, better. We have to learn as a society, but better at how we use resources. The energy savings investment will pay for themselves if prices remain elevated, which they have to be, and they will be because of carbon taxation. So even if the war comes to an end, a lot of the physical infrastructure has been destroyed. Natural gas that's imported through LNG will always have a physical market above the sending, because the process of liquefaction uses up a lot of energy. So there will always be a wedge. And again, it's the wrong cure to the wrong disease, because it means doing more carbon emissions, which again will have to become more expensive. So if we look at this, the UK has about, in this data, about 6 million properties who could do with better wall insulation, 7.5 million properties that could do with better floor insulation. There's a huge amount of gas boilers that should be replaced. And this doesn't cost a lot. Actually, the estimates from the data suggest we're talking about 60 to 120 billion pounds, which would produce, on the sample for which we have data, savings at current prices of about 10 billion to nearly 20 billion each. And again, insulation and boiler replacements are particularly effective. And ultimately, this is where we should be leading all our policy efforts in that direction. And again, if you think that the EPCs uses just model energy savings potential and so on, you worry about whether this is rightly measured, the UK, again, is doing actually a very good job at measuring these things. And this is some data that looks at actual microdata from households who have done a cavity wall insulation, who have replaced their boiler, and we've done solid wall insulation, pit loft insulation, what happens in terms of their energy savings. And it's confirmed in the data, and there's strong reasons to believe that these are actually underestimates, because the small subsample of households who actually did put deeds behind the words are a very special set of people. They're very different from the average person. And so there's strong reasons to believe that these are underestimates of the true treatment effects, which is something that I hope we can sort of develop further with Base, who's building a lot of this work. So where next? And how am I doing on time, actually? Can I have a minute? Okay, I'm very good. We're up to 10 minutes. Okay, very good. So where next? What should or could replace the EPG? Again, there's a lot of smart economists in the room. There's a lot of smart people, in the UK. The UK is home to some of the brightest sort of research institutes that are attracting a lot of talent. And so there's lots and lots of ideas to make sure that the policy path gets recalibrated in a way that actually enables our societies to realize this triple win of saving the environment, saving money, at the same time wanting sort of this energy weapon that has been unleashed to sow essentially social instability. And I would suggest a specific proposal, which is a two-tier tariff, but I know that there's other smart ways of doing it that could be also developed that have similar effects. But ultimately, there should be roughly 4 tenets that any sort of policy intervention should follow. One of them is to preserve price signals, to make sure that prices do what they should do, which is convey information about scarcity. What you do when you have the signal of scarcity is where you adjust the resource use. That is how basic economics work. And we need to make sure that politics, that in this country right now is shaped by a party that actually is pro-market, actually does not actually delivers based on its sort of DNA, so to say. The second bit is to make sure that ultimately social cohesion, social order doesn't sort of suffer. We need to have smart, targeted financial relief to households who simply cannot put up with the bills and who cannot adjust their consumption downwards because the building stock doesn't allow them to. And so this is a first very important tenet. The third tenet is to make sure that we have incentives in place that enable and encourage people to take up these energy efficiency upgrades. And this is homeowners, housing associations, and local councils. And they can all sort of work together to make sure that the incentives are put in place to encourage these permanent changes in essentially resource use that, again, we need as a society to make sure that this world remains habitable. And obviously, I love the big elephant in this room, and this is where some people should mention potentially the B word, Brexit. We need to tackle the supply side constraints, because ultimately this is the biggest issue that holds this country back. That the country has chosen a particular policy path that deprives itself from a certain a very flexible labor force that could come out. At the same time, actually, we need to think about a sustainable change to encourage knowledge transfer. Right now, I've spoke with some builders and so on. What they've telling me is that the rate of retirement of those who could transmit the knowledge of how to do stuff is actually faster than the rate at which they could train, which means there is a real issue on the supply side that we can't deny, and we need to think carefully about how to tackle it. So let me talk briefly about the two-tier proposal. So the two-tier tariff would look as follows. It would have 2 tiers. That's why a 2-tier proposal. We have an energy consumption that's subsidized for the first, certain units of energy consumption. Here it's modeled up to 12,000 kilowatt hours in the split for electricity and gas. And the second tier would have a much steeper tariff for the units that are consumed beyond that, so to say, allowance. And which actually, if we look at it, this is what sort of it would do to the average household bill. Again, we can do this looking into the distribution within the groups. I can tell you that from this proposal, 12.7 million households would be financially better off than with the current energy price guarantee. And this has been designed to cost roughly the same as the energy price guarantee. So this is literally just the benefit of targeting, actually make sure that resources are shifted to the households who might really struggle, thereby contributing to ensuring that social cohesion and sort of social peace essentially is maintained. And what we see here on the red line is the pre-war bills. The solid blue line on top is the market prices as per the October 22 cap, and the dashed line is the EPG. and a gray line is the two-tier tariff. And what you see is that basically households up to a household income of up to £70,000 would be better off on average with this policy proposal. And most importantly, I sort of skipped this, it preserves the energy savings incentives because the energy savings potential is unevenly distributed and mostly concentrated in the real estate that's mostly lived in by sort of rather well-off people. So a second policy that should come together is about tackling the incentives, which is making sure that households have incentives to do boiler replacements, to do insulation, and this should operate via grants for low-income households in a means-tested way, and could operate via tax incentives for higher income households. And the fiscal costs could even be clawed back because you could introduce a levy upon the sale of the property in the future that essentially sort of claws back some of the money that the public used to insulate the property. So it would get all of Britain invested in the green transition, which ultimately is something that I think is desirable and also something that I think resonates with people when it comes to how should we use our tax resources in a sustainable, in a long run way. I will leave it here. There's a lot more thoughts. I will leave it here and hand over to Ben, who's going to talk about the very smart German design and the European context in particular. Thanks a lot.
All right. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'll talk about at a general level. Tina already mentioned this. That there's sort of two main objectives any policy needs to fulfill, I think. One is to provide relief and help people who can't pay their gas or energy bills anymore. And then at the same time, you want to preserve incentives for reducing energy consumption or gas consumption. Tina really put into the one proposal for doing so that was a lot better than the energy price guarantee, which the problem with the energy price guarantee is that it puts these two objectives in direct conflict with each other. Right? The lower the price cap, or the lower the price, the cap price, the more you help households, but the worse you make the incentives for saving gas. And so Timo already provided one superior alternative that makes sense trade-off or puts these less in direct conflict with each other. I will show you can do even better, I think. And then this two-way tariff, at least including, it depends a bit on the institutional structure. And I talk in particular about a German proposal. Where this, I think, will work very nicely. I'm not sure it's possible to do this in the UK, but I think it's sort of useful to keep in mind, other options as well. Okay, so just to set the stage a bit, I'll repeat a bit of some of the things that Tino has already said. I just wanted to give you a very simple diagrammatic representation of what a gas bill of a household may look like and how that changes when prices change. And then I'll talk you through how different policies, including an energy price cap, change that picture and also these other schemes of this smarter German proposal or the two-way tariff that Timo has. This is a very basic picture, which basically for a household has gas consumption. So I'll mostly talk about gas, but you can apply the same points to electricity essentially. That has gas consumption on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, so in kilowatt hours, and then that has there's the amount of the gas bill of a household, say over a year on the y-axis. Here it's always in euros. That's because again we looked at this in the German context, but you can obviously replace that with pounds. So this is what a gas bill looked like in the pre-energy crisis era. So a year ago maybe, and maybe your price per kilowatt hours of gas that you consumed was 5 cents per kilowatt hours. So you have this gas bill that increases with gas consumption, but in a relatively shallow way, right? Now energy prices skyrocket. Okay, here in this example I'm giving, let's say energy prices or gas prices skyrocket by a factor of 5, from 5 to 25 cents per kilowatt hours. And now your gas bill is obviously a lot steeper, right? what this means in particular is that so someone used to consume 10,000 kilowatt hours here, used to have a gas bill of 500 euros. Now, if they don't adjust their behavior, will suddenly have a gas bill of 2,500 euros. And if your annual income, say, is 20 or 30,000 euros, and then that's a big problem, and you won't, you're really going to have to cut other expenditures. Maybe you won't be able to put food on the table anymore. Okay, so I do think it's really important. I mean, I think everyone agrees with this to say there are some households for whom this is a real problem, and we need to add them. Okay, just to take that off the table. Okay. And so the question is now, how can you do that? One way of doing this is a price cap, like the energy price guarantee. And so here, for example, let's assume we put a price cap, the green line, at 12 cents per kilowatt hours. Okay, that shifts down that line there from the blue dash line to the green line. And so it does do the trick in terms of helping people. Okay, it does, for example, reduce the gas bill of someone with 10,000 kilowatt hours from 2,500 euros to 1,200 euros. However, it comes with a big problem, which is it really makes a lot less strong the incentive for reducing gas consumption. Okay, right. So before for every kilowatt hour of gas that you reduced your consumption by, that you consumed less, you save 25 cents. And so, for example, if you save 1,000 kilowatt hours, you would have made quite a lot of savings there. Now, for every kilowatt hour of gas that you save, you only save 5 cents. It's still higher saving incentives than at the price before the energy crisis, but it's a lot less than at 25 cents. Okay, and so what I want to think about is, again, smarter policy options than the green line, which is basically like the energy price guarantee, that sort of straddle this conflict between helping people on the one hand, and at the same time leaving intact the incentives to preserve, to reduce energy. Okay. I wanted to, well, maybe let me say before I do that, one other thing. But there's actually some nice economics here, and I think philosophy of economic theory provides like a good way of thinking about it. And basic economics says essentially that when a price goes up, this has two types of effects. One is called an income effect, and the second one is called a substitution effect. The income effect is the price goes up, we're putting out. Okay? The substitution effect is the price goes up, so you want to save gas and substitute towards other energy sources. The key thing to realize here is the income effect is our enemy, right? That's a bad thing because we're poor. But the substitution effect is our friend, right? Like we want people to substitute, okay? And the key policy design issue essentially is how to help people alleviate sort of this income effect, but at the same time leave the substitution effect intact, by which you still substitute towards other energy sources like green energy, or you just turn on your thermostat essentially to save gas and prevent shortages, right? And the social fabric falling apart and so on. Okay. Okay. So here's I wanted to talk about one specific proposal that I like, and I've been involved in some of this debate that comes from my home country of Germany, which is I think a better proposal than either the energy price guarantee, and I also want to say the two-way tariff that TUNO has. I'm going to say that the two-way tariff in the end, the TUNO proposals, is still pretty good, okay, and a lot better than the energy price guarantee. But I'm going to say that we can, in principle, do sort of even slightly better. Okay, the starting point here is again that it's absolutely crucial to support households, especially the economically weaker ones, in the face of rising gas prices. But the key idea that I'm going to push, and that's a little bit in Timo's proposal as well, but not as much as it could be, is that this should be done by means of transfers that are not directly tied to your current gas consumption, and that preserve the incentives for reducing gas consumption. You want to do it in a way where you basically give people money and they get to keep that money, even if they reduce their energy consumption a lot. Okay? In economics language, that's what's called basically a lump sum transfer, okay? Rather than a subsidy or a price cap. Okay? And so that's exactly basically what the German proposal is. It's sort of a lump sum transfer, but still one that's sort of targeted according to people in individual households' gas consumption. Okay, the idea for this is different people who've worked on this. We've written a bunch of papers on the energy crisis in Germany in particular, and Europe more broadly. And one of my co-authors, Christian Bayer, he kind of had this idea, or was one of the people from other research teams had similar ideas, and they were featured in our papers. And so what they basically did, I should also say, in Germany, sort of in good German fashion, they put together this sort of a commission with some guys from the unions, some guys from the industry lobby, but then luckily, I would say they also put a fair bunch of economists on that commission. Okay, and in particular, my co-authors and other good economists, and they came up with this sort of a smart proposal to straddle these two conflicts. If you have access to the slides, I'm not sure you do. I put there the link to the proposal. This is in German, but you can use your Chrome, your browser's translation feature to look at this. And I think again, I'm going to say it's a good policy. So here's how this works. This is just to repeat the picture I had before as a starting point. This is just again gas consumption in kilowatt hours there, and then your gas and the different prices on the y-axis. Before explaining the scheme, I want to make one more little change, which is to think about not total consumption in kilowatt hours, but your gas consumption basically relative to your previous year's gas consumption. Okay, so I'm now changed just the x-axis to say percentage of historical gas consumption. Okay, and the idea is that sort of your historical gas consumption is sort of a good proxy of what your typical gas usage is. Okay, and so for example, now suppose you used to consume 10,000 kilowatt hours, so I'm now just call that 100% of your previous gas consumption. So here's basically the scheme that the German Gas Commission is proposing, okay? Which I'm going to describe it to you in words, but it's basically going to end up being the red line, okay? The idea is to give people a transfer that's based on the historical gas consumption, not the current gas consumption, and then it's the historical gas consumption times 80%, so 80% of the historical gas consumption, and then times the difference between the current high market price, whatever would be the 25 cents per kilowatt hours there, and a cap price, so the 12 cents. Okay, and the key thing there was the use of the historical consumption in that in that scheme. Okay, if it were your current consumption times the difference in the gap between the price, the high price and the low price, that would be just a subsidy. Okay, and like we're doing in the UK basically. But the key thing is here, rather than using your current consumption as the base, you're using your past consumption as the base. Okay, this has a number of nice effects. Okay, so A, you're helping households. Obviously, you're giving them money. Okay, so that's the social of the provision of relief. Well, I guess I also wanted to say, relative to Judge's introduction, I wouldn't think about it so much as fiscal policy, rather as just providing insurance. Basically, there's some households who, are just unlucky with their broadband in the sense that they have a gas heating, and now they just got hit by the shock, and so we're basically, I think the right way to think about it is we're providing insurance to these households. Okay, rather than sort of fiscal policy and stimulating aggregate demand, it's really just a provision of insurance, a little bit like the deferral scheme during COVID or something. And so you provide this insurance, but at the same time, you leave intact incentives to save gas. In particular, you can see the red line there, as the same is true as the blue dash line. Remember, the blue dash line was your gas bill with the really high, 25 cents per kilowatt hours, which was this price. It was like 5 times higher than the pre-crisis price. You
can see the red line has the same slope of this, which is to say that for every kilowatt hour of gas that you save, you still earn 25 cents, basically. And so you can make a lot of money by saving gas. In fact, the scheme has the feature that you can see the red line there hits zero at some point at sort of roughly 30%. And the scheme has the feature that you can actually reduce your gas bill to zero, even at positive consumption, okay? By just saving an air, if you save sufficient amount of gas, you can actually save gas. There's currently a discussion going on right now in Germany, which is like what should happen when you go below this sort of 30% here. Will we actually have a negative gas bill? Will we actually make money with this or not? And they're debating whether, which one is the right way to go. But yeah, if you strictly want to maximize incentives, you should then give people money once they go below that. Now, I'm just going to say this in words. I mentioned this already before. So there's a price change basically has these two effects. One being a good effect, our friend, and one being a bad effect, our enemy. The good effect is the substitution effect, that you save gas and substitute towards alternative. The bad effect is the income effect, which is that you're poorer when the price goes up. Okay? But the beauty of the scheme is kind of it helps with the income effect. Okay? In particular, it puts more money into people's pockets in a pretty targeted way, in the sense that it depends on your typical energy usage. Okay? But it completely leaves intact the sort of substitution effect, and you still have all the incentives to preserve energy. Okay? There's a graph for the economists in the room where you can see this nicely with your standard diagram, but I'm going to skip. Okay? I just wanted to contrast this scheme with the scheme that Timo likes, which is a tariff, or what I call it, a price cap up to some amount of energy consumption. Here, this is slightly different from what Timo had, but this is sort of another proposal that was proposed in the German context, which was a price cap up to 80% of your previous energy consumption. And you can see that price cap, so that's the green line here, that price cap up to some maximum amount of money, but basically look like the energy price guarantee, just like a cap price up to some amount, and here 80% of your previous consumption. But then the line gets a lot steeper. So the green line there has a kink, where you can see, and that's the market price being there. That scheme is a lot better, as I said, than the energy price guarantee. Why? Because it's, while providing relief, does leave intact the incentives for saving energy. If you're like sort of on that part of the schedule here, right, the steep one. But then once you go below here, sort of say you're like a rich household, I guess in Timo's scheme, that can actually save more than 20% of their previous year's gas consumption, right? Then in this scheme, you would basically not have that much of an incentive to go beyond those 20%, because when we're beyond those 20%, the amount of extra money you can save is not that much. So the marginal price there becomes not that much. But again, the scheme is still a lot better than, with that green line we just sort of continued here, which is basically the energy price guarantee, which doesn't give, or gives very little incentives for saving energy to begin with. Okay. So it's sort of, in my mind, a second best alternative. And I guess depending on what the institutional constraints are, one can do better or not. So in Germany, the way this is done, I should say, this is run via the energy suppliers, okay? And in particular, it's run at the individual gas meter level. So the energy suppliers basically, rather than just sending the bills to households, send them to the state. And then the other thing that's important for the distributional effect is these payments are subject to the income tax, okay? And so for the rich guys, if they get this payment, a lot of this gets actually clawed back by the state through the income tax, which I don't know if that's possible in the UK, for example. I'm going to skip this and just say one more thing that I think is actually also very important for Timo's scheme, okay? And that's actually, again, something we know from economics, okay? What's really important for whenever you have a
one of these either lump sum schemes like the one I like or a two-way tab that Timo likes is essentially that people understand it. Okay, if it doesn't understand, it's not going to work. Okay, but in fact, there's sort of some economics literature that talks about this, and defining this is a paper here that I'm covering. That's a random paper in the energy literature. And in economics language, what they find is that consumers respond to sort of average prices. So what's your just your total gas bill? People care about maybe per average consumption, and they do not respond so much to sort of marginal prices, which is how much extra can I sell by reduce my consumption by 1 kilowatt hours. Okay. However, there's another set of papers that then basically say, if you just explain this to people well enough, then they change their behavior. Okay, information campaigns can help, right? The problem is, really to my mind here, is that there could not be enough information like this. In particular, actually, at least in Germany, also I think here, politicians, the way they talk about these schemes are actually actively counterproductive. Okay, politicians very often say the prices are high, we need to bring down the prices. Okay, that's not true. Like, the prices are high for a reason. Okay, and the reason is that gas is scarce, and we need to allocate it efficiently. And there's nothing rejected said this. There's nothing we can do about this. This is Putin's fault. Okay, but the problem is not that the prices are high. The problem is that the total gas bills are high. That the costs are high. So what we need to do is we need to bring down the total costs, but while leaving the high prices intact, at least at the margin. And these kind of schemes do it, but then you need to explain this to people, and rather than saying, right, in Germany, the chancellor always goes around and says, the prices are really high, my scheme is going to bring down the prices, which is actually wrong. Like, that's not what the proposal of the commission actually does. But he just talks about it the wrong way. And then the proposal can be as ingenious as you want. If the politicians go around talking about it in the wrong way and no one understands it, then it's basically completely destroys the purpose of the scheme. Okay, I'm going to stop with this. So again, like, I think this is also, hopefully in the UK, we can either do something like the scheme I have or the scheme that Timo has. And in both cases, information campaigns will be really important. You need essentially the politicians to go on TV. We need like posters at the bus stops that explain to people how much they can save by turning down their thermostats and so on. And then hopefully we're going to have better energy policy with a combination of this sort of better schemes and communicating. Correct. Yeah. Thumbs up here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Timo and Ben for some very rich presentations. I won't comment on them now. I'll talk about what we've been doing at NISA in this area. And really, since February, our February Outlook, which contains a chapter on regions and households, we've been looking at how best to provide help with rising energy prices. And I should say, of course, that this is teamwork together with my colleagues Arnab Everhudji and Max Mosley. Max is here with us. Arnab is currently in Belfast, so couldn't join us on this occasion. I know you read our outlooks religiously, so I won't summarize everything we've done, but I do want to take us back to where we were at the beginning of August, when we published our summer outlook, and we, at that point, could already anticipate that Ofgem was going to raise the energy price cap to something in the region of 3,000 FL. That being trailed quite widely ahead of that announcement a couple of weeks after we published the outlook. And what we found then was something very striking, which is that the impact of raising the energy price cap from what was then roughly £2,000 to roughly £3,500 would have, in the absence of further help, had an incredible impact on household finances. We found three things. First, about 5 million people in the UK would have had no savings by April 24 had that price cap increase gone ahead. That's 5 million households without any savings whatsoever by April 24. But let me stress, in the absence of further help. But help had already been provided in May. I'll come back to that. Okay? But had the government done nothing else other than the help provided in the 26th of May statement, over 5 million households would have been left with no savings. A further 7 million would have essentially had insufficient savings, defined as savings less than 2 months' worth of income. Okay, that's living paycheck to paycheck, if I may put it in those terms. And another 1.2 million households would have seen their energy and food bills only exceed the disposable income, with some very, very extreme impact on households. Okay? And you can see the savings effect, rather the effect in households without savings on this slide. Now, there was both a household component to this, but of course, there's a strong regional dimension. Okay? These households that are struggling, they would have seen their savings wiped out, are not equally distributed around the country, as you can imagine. They're concentrated in certain parts. If you take just a very broad picture of the United Kingdom, so not very granular, of course, there are pockets of deprivation everywhere. But if you look in broad regional terms, it would have been especially concentrated in the northeast. Okay? So you add to deprivation in those parts of the country that are already struggling if you raise the energy price cap in this way and you do nothing else. Now, it is true that when the now former Prime Minister Liz Truss announced the energy price plan on the 8th of September, and that would have essentially led to something like limiting the unit price such that typical households would pay no more than 2,500. So, of course, some households will pay a lot more, those that are consuming a lot more than household does, but 2,500 would have been roughly the bill for a typical household. This is a household that both Timo and Ben also mentioned. Now, what we should say here is that it is true that that would have provided an immediate relief, including to the poorest. And what we mustn't forget is that even with a price cap of around 2,500 for a typical household, the energy prices that the poorest pay, but that is the better income decile, would have still been more than 30% higher than last year. But still a very significant increase in their energy bills. And that increase is not offset by the help that was provided by the former Chancellor, now Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, on the 26th of May. When we published our May outlook, that was, I think, on the 9th of May, if I remember correctly, we said there needed to be targeted help so that the poorest would not face further poverty and even destitution. 2 weeks later, when Sunak announced the May measures on the 26th, to be precise, some of that was taken into account. So there were 650 payments, the 400 general subsidy, which we're opposed to, I'll come back to that in a moment, and also some more payments for pensioners and disability benefits and so on. But the fact of the matter is this: if you do a general subsidy along the lines that the energy price guarantee provides, then you are spending a lot of money on the wealthiest households who don't need it, and you're not using the same resources to help those who really do. So let me talk you through briefly what a variable price cap would look like, which is the thing that we have since developed. So it's very clear that those on high incomes can afford much higher energy bills because they have both the incomes and the savings to take a hit. Yes, of course, they will be worse off, but energy is a smaller proportion of their overall household budget, and frankly, they will need extra help to cover those bills. And when you're paying a general subsidy, you're not just giving a household £400. You're giving a household that owns a second and a third home that £400 several times. In other words, you're giving the richest a lot more money, right, per household than you are giving the poorest. It doesn't make any sense. It's economically inefficient, it's socially iniquitous, and it's ecologically wasteful for reasons we will see in a minute. Now, the general problem with a variable price cap, you might say, is, well, how do we know who consumes what? And that's a fair question or objection. But it is the case, it's already been mentioned, that there's a strong correlation between income and energy consumption. So that those on high incomes tend to consume more energy. Why? Because they tend to live in bigger accommodation, and they tend to just worry a bit less about whether they leave the lights on or whether the radiator or whatever else runs a bit longer or things aren't standby. So that is just a strong correlation which we can observe, and therefore you could do a variable price cap in the way that we have suggested. So what would that look like? It would essentially mean that the price of energy goes up per unit. Okay, so at the lowest level of consumption, you have a lower price, and the more you consume, the more you pay per unit. Okay. So what would be the effect? Well, the effect is simply that whereas at the moment, with a general subsidy, the bills are different, but not that different. So the poorest will be paying something like 1,800 or maybe even 2,000, so a lot less than last year. The richest will be paying something like 3.5. Yes, there's a big difference there, but obviously for a richer household, they can easily cope with bills that are higher than 3.5. Whereas the poorest can't cope with those bills of 1,800 or 2,000. The main the other advantage is that depending on how you structure that variable price cap, you could make it fiscally neutral. So that actually you don't have to subsidize anyone at all, because the money you get from the wealthy household will essentially pay for the reduction in bills for a household. So you put this out in such a way it's totally fiscally neutral. If you want to make it less than fiscally neutral, fine, that can be a political choice. And of course, there are other reasons where you might need to do more than just a variable price cap. With the challenges, the heterogeneity of households. So you can have low-income households with a larger number of dependents, larger families, people looking after elderly relatives. You can have low-income households living in pretty insulated accommodation, which is often the case, which means energy consumption is higher, or households living in wetter, colder parts of the country. By the way, again, energy consumption is very high. All of this is true, but it doesn't negate the principle of a variable price. All it means is that you would then use grants or other forms of targeted support to help those families cope with the energy bills. I haven't talked much about the other aspects of this, but it's really to say that this scheme has the three advantages I've hinted at. It's economically much less inefficient than the general subsidy, because it takes the help to the people who need it most. That makes it socially fairer, and crucially, it builds on the green element. Everyone has an incentive to save, but those who use a lot of energy have the strongest incentive to save because their energy bills would otherwise go up by a lot. So it builds in a green element into the cost structure, into the price mechanism itself. And that, I think, is the key element that no general subsidy can ever achieve. That's what we've argued for, and that is something we'd like to develop in the run-up to our next outlook, which will be in mid-November. And we also hope that today's event help shape the debate around energy policy, because as the Chancellor has said, the energy price guarantee will be in place for 6 months, and thereafter it will be more targeted. Or we think a variable price cap is precisely a more targeted policy. And that's why we want to keep on developing those ideas. Thank you very much.